Hello everyone, it is WTCO here with an alternative history scenario. The scenario we will be reading today is, what if the United States joined the Central Powers in World War I instead of the Entente? Now many of you at home may be saying to yourselves that this is a completely unbelievable scenario, but no, in fact, this was a possibility even in our own timeline, at least in the beginning of the war. There already was a lot of pro-German propaganda in America that painted the Great War as a war between the White Teutons and the Slavic barbarians. The Russians were condemned by the pro-German media as Cossacks and half-cultured Tartars, while the British and French were exercised for using colored savage troops and encouraging Japanese intervention and conquest of German territories, without troubling about the consequences to the universal progress of the white race. Now, knowing what the Germans were telling the Americans, it is easy to believe that if just a few more notable American politicians lobbied for the German and Central Powers in the U.S. government, then the U.S. could have joined World War I on the opposite side that they did in our timeline. Now, with all the groundwork laid on the table, let's go on to the theory. Our theory would start with soon-to-be President Woodrow Wilson in his campaign for presidency in 1912. Woodrow Wilson, being a Southern Democrat, was already worried about the so-called decline of the white race. And so, in this timeline, this would be his platform he would win off of, opposed to in our timeline where he won off a platform of pro-segregation and tax reform. Now, when the propaganda began to flood into the USA in the late 1914, the president would be friendly to the Germans as they were seen as the white crusaders in the eyes of the people because of the propaganda used by the Wilson administration already. Wilson was not pro-German privately, but he couldn't risk his public image by supporting the French or British. So the American public would be pro-German, but not yet pro-war. In 1915, America would begin to lend-lease a large amount of guns, planes, and foods to the German Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire through the North Sea and Straits of Gibraltar. This wouldn't last long, for the British would use her Great Fleet to blockade the Germans in a similar way to unrestricted submarine warfare used by the Germans in our own timeline. The British would fire at any ship that would attempt to go to German or Austrian ports. This would, in February of 1917, result in the British Royal Navy sinking the German passenger ship, the Oceania, carrying nearly 1,000 American tourists going to Germany. With the sinking of the Oceania and killing of American civilians, the United States would declare war on the British Empire and her allies in April of 1917. The United States would launch an immediate invasion of the British and French colonies in the Americas, which in the first 6 months American forces would take the Bahamas, Bermuda, Canada, and Newfoundland. The Russians would also leave the war after the October Revolution of November 11th happened, as it did in our timeline. By the end of 1917, the United States Marine Corps would begin a process known as island hopping in the Pacific in order to take down the British, Dutch, French colonies such as Australia, Micronesia, Dutch East India, Brunei, British Malaya, New Zealand, and French Indochina, and their ally at the time, Empire of Japan. This is where the US would continue fighting for the majority of the war. And on March of 1918, after the extremely deadly and extremely expensive Battle of Iwo Jima, the Japanese would be promised the Dutch East Indies in exchange for fighting alongside the Americans in the Pacific, and the Empire of Japan would officially switch sides to the Central Powers, helping the Americans in the Pacific Theater. It would be around the same time that the French morale would begin to go at an all-time low, as it did in our timeline, except it would be even worse. There had already been many large-scale desertions, and the situation was dire. The British still would have hope among their population and average morale among her troops, but the Pacific Campaign being turned against them, King George V would begin to seek other options to turn the war around in the British Empire's favor. The Americans had yet to see combat in Europe in large numbers because of the English Navy continuing to blockade the entire American fleet, and the entire American war machine was focused on the Pacific, with her ally of Japan. In September, after waiting all summer, Operation Sunrise and Operation Sunset would be launched out of Papua New Guinea and onto the beaches of Australia and New Zealand. After the devastating defeat in Gallipoli, the Anzacs could not muster a defense sufficient enough to repel the American and Japanese invasion, and on Christmas Day, only a month later after the invasion, Australia and New Zealand would both formally surrender and end British rule, accepting their new American occupation. At the end of 1918, the situation in Europe was dire. Both sides were bleeding manpower and couldn't keep up the war for long. The Germans had begun to receive much needed food from fast American blockade runners that had been specially built for this situation. But there could only be so much sent in, so food was prioritized over lend-leasing of equipment. In February of 1919, Japan and American forces would withdraw the majority of their army from French Indochina after fierce resistance. The Americans would begin to send airdrops of guns and ammunition to the Vietnamese natives, who would begin to wage a guerrilla-style war against the French troops in Indochina. In July of 1919, the U.S. Navy would engage the British fleet in the Battle of the North Sea. The American fleet would be crushed, but at a devastating cost to the British, who would now understand that it wasn't just their colonies threatened, but their island themselves. After this defeat, the Americans would begin to send guns to Irish rebels, who would begin to fight British in small numbers, similar to the Vietnamese to the French. After much more bloody fighting, the Treaty of New York would be signed on the first day of 1920, calling for a ceasefire, and the Treaty of Boston would be signed on July 23rd of 1920, establishing the new world borders and an official stalemate. All blame of the war was officially put onto the Serbian government that was now annexed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The treaty was also created the League of Nations, the American territory of Oceania encompassing Australia and New Zealand, an independent Ireland and independent Vietnam, both with pro-American governments, and the Japanese co-prosperity sphere, which included the now Japanese East Indies. The effect of this war would be too big for me to explain in this video, so if you would like me to go into further, please let me know and I'll make a part 2 for this video that will go into the future and see how this scenario goes out. This has been WTCO. Have a good one.